Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Kupyansk, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance in the western parts of Kupyansk, working around the town, looking to cut off the last remaining supply routes leading in and out of it. The Russians also managed to advance in the western bank of the Serbs River line, but on the northern flank. The Russians made advances in the western parts of Toretsk, along the reservoir area and inside the town of Katerinivka. The Russians also managed to advance in between Kupyansk and Pokrovsk, as well as in the southern parts of Pokrovsk with new geolocated footage of Russian DRG activity deep within the city on the eastern parts of it. The Russians also managed to advance to the west of Pokrovsk in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region inside the Zaporizhzhia region along the border area, and there was some geolocated footage of Russian activity in the town of Stefanhersk in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia region. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians continued advances in the western parts of Kupyansk. This geolocated footage actually shows deep activity of the Russians within the town of Sobolivka. However, this was a single soldier who moved through the forest patch area. The Russians are slowly clearing the remaining areas of Moskovka and the northwestern outskirts of Kupyansk. While doing so, they are doing some reconnaissance missions, clearing the forest patches in the area where a few soldiers managed to pass through, but the front line has not moved that far yet. Rather, the Russians managed to gain control over the southern parts of Moskovka and are lining the front line in the northern parts of the town. But we will be seeing additional advances by the Russians here in the western parts of Kupyansk to cut off the western highway leading into the town from the southwest, leaving only the southern road in and out of Kupyansk along the Uskar River line. The southern highway is connected to this railway that goes all the way through the Uskar River line towards Kupyansk-Voslovy. And through this, the Ukrainians can resupply their forces and then up towards Kupyansk. Therefore, the Russians, if they want to completely cut off Kupyansk, they would need to either operationally encircle by gaining control over Sobolivka and Sadova, and gaining physical control over the southwestern highway, leaving just the southern highway, where they have fire control over the highway. There's also the possibility of them resupplying their forces through the Uskar River line towards Kashirivka and Kupyansk-Voslovy, and then upwards towards the eastern parts of Kupyansk. Which is why the Russians would likely combine their efforts on the western parts of the Uskar River line with new offensive operations on the eastern parts to physically cut off any connection towards Kupyansk. The Ukrainians have crossings across the Uskar River line, but these are a primary target of Russian missile strikes in the area at the moment to completely cut off the connection across the Uskar River line, combined with their fighting in the Kupyansk direction. In the direction of the Serbs River line, the Russians made a small advance here to the southwest of Rakivka. Following the Ukrainian counterattack, the Russians are now regaining control over the forest lines, southwestern flank of the town, as he looked to gain full control over the Luhansk region in the vicinity of Rakivka. In the direction of Toretsk, there are several developments. The Russians have managed to enter into Katerinivka and gain control over the fortified positions to the south of the town. As you look at the footage here, confirms the Russian presence within the town, as they are looking to push the Ukrainians out of it and gain control over both Katerinivka and Klibenvik along the high ground in the western parts of the pocket, which has now become very small, as it only includes a small part of the residential area, the industrial zone, the towns of Katerinivka and Klibenvik. At the same time, the Russians managed to advance along the fortified positions on the northern flank in the vicinity of the reservoir, where they managed to gain control over several fortified positions here to the northern flank of the industrial zone, and they were advancing towards the reservoir itself, but the Ukrainians launched some counterattacks, regaining control over parts of it in an attempt to prevent the Russians physically cutting off the encirclement with what remains of the Ukrainian forces within the pocket. The Russians are slowly gaining full control over the southern flank of the reservoir here to the south of Kościantinivka, gaining control over the entirety of it, while the Russians focus their efforts on the southeastern parts of Kościantinivka in the direction of Oleksandr-Shultine, Rechine, and Ivanopilya, while also allowing them to advance along the fortified positions north of Oleksandr-Kalinova and Yablonivka in the direction of Stepanivka, Dolgopolka, Roshchishne, and Mykolaiv-Pilya. The Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Rosin Yar, expanding zone of control within the town and along the fortified positions in the eastern parts of it. Russians are looking to gain control over the last remaining town in between Kościantinivka and Pokrovsk outside the defensive lines, the area in between. This allowed the Russians to start the fighting here in the direction of Stepanivka and then upwards towards Mykolaiv-Pilya with the combined efforts from the eastern and western parts following the capture of the fortified positions. In the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians managed to gain control over southwestern outskirts of the city, and there's also this geolocated footage of DRG activity in the eastern parts of the city. Based on these two developments, we can see the Russians are continuously moving to gain control over several areas within the city, bypassing the Shakhtarsk district and the main defensive positions of the Ukrainians. The Russian capture of the southwestern outskirts of the city of Pokrovsk is solely allowing the Russians to establish supply lines for any forces operating within the city and to increase the amount of soldiers they have fighting within it. The Russians are also pushing to gain control over Troyenda, which will open up the road for a stable supply line through the forest patch area and into the city. It will also allow the Russians to bypass the Shakhtarsk district, moving into the city and fighting over other areas where they can establish themselves within the city. These include the carbon complex area on the northern flank of Shakhtarsk district, the railway area in the central parts of the city, the industrial area in the northwestern or northeastern parts of the city. Based on the DRG activity and developments on the northern and southern flanks of Pokrovsk, the Russians may be looking to establish control over the southwestern parts of the city, move onwards towards the railway area and the central parts of it, and then move onwards towards the northeastern industrial area, cutting the city into the southern and northwestern parts. The reason for this is the Russian offensive operations on the northern flank of Pokrovsk in the direction of Belitske and Rodinske. The Russians gain control over these two towns will allow the Russians to start pushing towards the city from the north, gaining control over the industrial area in the northeast by connecting their forces in the northern and southern flanks of the city will allow the Russians to not just cut Pokrovsk into two, but also to isolate the Shakhtarsky and southeastern parts of the city from the remaining parts of Ukraine, physically encircling the Ukrainian forces both within the southeastern parts of the city, the settlements in between Pokrovsk and Milnorad, and the frontline fortifications and positions of the Ukrainians all across the eastern parts of Pokrovsk. This would be a major encirclement of a large grouping of Ukrainian forces. The Russians are already operating within the railway area with their advances on the southwest outskirts of Pokrovsk. It is clear the Russians are focusing on the eastern parts based on several geolocations in the central and eastern parts, with only a single one here in the western parts. At the same time, the Russian operations in the north can only have a few targets. There is a push towards the west, north, or south. These are the three possibilities. It could be all three of them, it could be one of the three. The western push would be to cut off the roads from a western flank. We'll also be able to cut off the road within the city itself. A push to the south would be to physically cut off all roads between Pokrovsk and Milnorad, encircling Milnorad in its entirety and all of the surrounding fortifications and settlements. And the push in the north would be towards Dobropilya, bypassing the city of Pokrovsk and moving onwards beyond the defensive positions of the Ukrainians, attacking them in unprepared positions. All three are viable options, but the most ambitious and effective would likely be the capture of the central, northeastern, and southwestern parts of the city to completely encircle Mednorad and the surrounding settlements and fortified positions. This would have a major effect on the Ukrainian forces, gain control over Mednorad and Pokrovsk. That way will allow them to significantly develop offensive operations in the western parts of the Donetsk region, as a large grouping of Ukrainian forces would be lost in a single battle. To the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain a foothold in the southwestern parts of Dashne, following several days of assaults from the southwestern parts, gaining control of the fortified positions. The Russians now have a foothold within the residential area, pushing the Ukrainians back to the railway station in the central parts of the town and into the northern residential area. Russians will likely soon gain full control over Dashne with this recent development, pushing the Ukrainians out of the southern parts of the town in its entirety. Within the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region into the Zaporizhia region, the Russians consider offensive operations along the border area, along the fortified positions, to gain control over those in the flanks of Timirivka. As previously mentioned, the Russian tactic now is whenever the Ukrainians counterattack, they advance on the flanks, bypass the Ukrainian counterattack, and keep up the momentum of their advances. Russian objective to gain control over the fortified positions on the flanks of the Ukrainian counterattack, securing their positions, and putting the Ukrainians in a pincer maneuver by attacking them on the flanks. In the southern outskirts of the front line in the Zaporizhia region, geolocated footage shows the Ukrainians striking a Russian position here to the northwest of the small apartment complex area to the south of Stepnohirsk. The Russians are bypassing Ukrainian positions recently with their offensive operations, where they look to infiltrate the Ukrainian lines' established positions in the rear and disrupt the Ukrainian lines of communications and supply. With these recent developments, we see that the Russians continue offensive operations on the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region and the eastern outskirts of it, along the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, bypassing them as well in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, advancing in the direction of Pokrovsk, the area between Pokrovsk and Kościantynivka's flanks, as well as the defensive positions along the Server line in the Liman and Siversk directions, as well as the Usk River line in the direction of Kupyansk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.